Socrates. Little background for Socrates. He was born 470 BC, died in 399 BC, and is of course still dead today. He was the son of a sculptor and a midwife, and according to the stories about him, he was rather eccentric in appearance and manner. Like many philosophers, even today, his clothes were rumpled and presumably out of style. He is said to have walked like a pelican, and according to the contemporary reports, he was ugly, yet very robust. Like many of the free citizens of Athens, he served in the military, and apparently served, well, with honor. Now, one of the things that Socrates is known for is, of course, his famous view of wisdom. And this is kind of his backstory about wisdom. In addition to fighting with the sophists, this is also part of his motivation. So, one of Socrates' friends went to the oracle at Delphi. And the oracle, since they didn't have Google back then, essentially was a gateway to the gods. You can look at it as kind of like a Google uplinking to the gods. And if you had a question that you needed answered that could not be answered by mere mortals, you'd go to the oracle at Delphi and you would ask them a question. And typically they would give you some sort of cryptic or vague response, the kind you see in movies when there are prophecies or video games when there are prophecies. And they often engaged in ambiguity. So, for example, famously, they were asked by a great king who wanted to go to war. He said, "What would happen if I go to war?" And the oracle answered back, "If you go to war, a great kingdom will be destroyed." And he went to war, and of course a great kingdom was destroyed, but it was his, twist ending. Now, when Socrates' friend went to the oracle and asked the oracle who is the wisest of men, there was no vagueness. There was no weird prophecy or rhymes or anything. Just a straight up response that Socrates was the wisest of men. So his friend goes back to him and says, "Soc, guess what?" And Soc says, "What?" And his friend says, "Guess who's the wisest of all?" And Socrates says, "Who could it be?" And his friend says, "You, Socrates, you." And Socrates, of course, believing himself to not be wise, set out to prove the gods wrong. And the way he did this, of course, was trying to find someone wiser. Now, to use the obvious analogy, if someone said that you are the fastest of runners, and for some reason you wanted to disprove that, you would go and challenge people to races. And if no one can beat you, then you are the fastest. So what he did is set out on his mission to disprove the gods and spoke to politicians, poets, craftspeople, and he found that they were all far less wise than they claimed, and that those who presented themselves as the wisest and best turned out to be the least wise, or perhaps not wise at all. Now, many historians of dead philosophers believe this is the main reason he was brought up to trial, for essentially making politicians, poets, and craftspeople look bad. Now, when it comes to the historical Socrates, there are many unanswered questions. One problem is this. Socrates, or at least the Socrates reported by our good dead friend Plato, apparently held that philosophy was a matter for conversation and talk, and not for books. So we don't have any writings directly written by Socrates. Now, in the early Platonic dialogues, this is to say the ones that were written early, and this gets a little muddled. There's two ways to look at the dialogues. They're the ones that are written early and the ones that are written later in Plato's life. They're also the ones that are set early and the ones that are set later. To use kind of a Star Wars analogy, Episode 4, A New Hope, the first Star Wars film to come out, came out back in the 70s. But it's the fourth film. And then later on, George Lucas came out with the first three after. And so we have the later George Lucas making the films that are set earlier, and the younger George Lucas making the films that are set later. Even though, you've got late George Lucas, but then you also have late Star Wars. And to all the non-nerds out there, I apologize for the Star Wars reference. So in the early Platonic dialogues, the ones that Plato wrote early in his life, they seem to be, or at least according to what the claims are, accurate transcriptions of the conversations of Socrates. Essentially, his conversations recorded. Now, the later dialogues, the ones written later in Plato's life, they seem more Plato speaking through Socrates because of the changes in the views. The Apology is a relatively early one, so it's, even though it's obviously, spoiler, he gets sentenced to death and then just later dies. Even though the Apology is set late in Socrates' life, near the end, it's one of the earlier written dialogues, and so it seems likely to be genuine Socrates. Now, the truth is not known for sure, and people who do, Platonic studies debate about this at great length. Now, as I mentioned before, one of the main foes of Socrates was the sophist. And Socrates did learn from the sophist. He studied under the sophist Prodicus, but since Socrates was not very wealthy, he could only afford the cheap course, the incomplete course. And he kind of joked about that. So why was he critical of the sophist? Well, the first thing is this. He criticized them for not seeking knowledge, while they presumed to instruct people about the nature of success, which seems to be a bit of a problem because they don't seek knowledge, yet claim they can tell people what success is. He argued that these sophists were giving people mere images and illusions, essentially misleading and deceiving them. And he regarded the sophists as a threat to the morality of society. Now, looking back, what we learned about the sophists, they explicitly, in their worldview, rejected objective ethics. And so if you believe in objective ethics and objective truth, the sophists would be a clear enemy. And as I noted before, the sophists are not a thing of the ancient past alone, they're alive and well today, pushing forth the notion of success at all costs without really understanding what success is or being able to defend it. Also, professing to hold to moral views, yet acting in direct contrast with those, or rejecting morality altogether. Now, for our good dead friend Socrates, the greatest danger stemmed from ignorance. Now, sometimes people smush together ignorance and stupidity, like being dumb, but ignorance is not that. A person could be brilliant, yet ignorant. In fact, all of us are ignorant about some things, because ignorance is simply a lack of knowledge. And we all lack knowledge because we're not omniscient. I guess the only exception would be an omniscient being like God's supposed to be. Now, for Socrates, the worst ignorance of all, the ignorance above all ignorances, would be to not know that one does not know. In other words, to believe that one knows when one does not. And there have been various arguments today presenting this as a very serious problem, where we have people who think they know things, but they totally do not, and they make claims with utter confidence and utter ignorance, not knowing that they don't know, which is super dangerous. Now, Socrates saw his job as curing this ignorance. So the disease was ignorance. The worst manifestation of the disease was being ignorant about one's ignorance, and he saw himself as the cure. So how did Socrates go about trying to cure this ignorance? Well, he developed what has become known as the Socratic Method. And it has a couple modes to it. Now, you'll often hear people today, very, very recently there was of course, a Zoom thing, because we're not doing anything in person anymore, about using the Socratic Method at FAMU. Well, again, technically through online. And people talk about using the Socratic Method in business, etc. So what is this Socratic Method straight from the Socrates' mouth? Well, a key part of it is questioning. as you might imagine, philosophy is all about asking questions and trying to answer them. So for Socrates, the method of questioning is known as the dialectic. What is this? Well, it's a conversational method. You're talking. And it involves a series of questions and answers. And it's sort of a rinse and repeat sort of deal. When someone answers the question, the defects in the answer lead the person answering it and the person raising the question to develop a better answer. And then the end result, at least in the Socratic method, is that the person starts off, pretty confident, thinking they know all this stuff, and the more questions they're asked, they eventually realize that they don't know what they thought they knew. And if they're not, locked into arrogance, they would begin the search for truth. They would realize their lack and try to correct it. Now, one of his main targets of Socrates was the politicians. And the politicians threw out all these moral terms and talked about, goodness and justice and virtue. And Socrates went to them thinking, hey, these people are always talking about virtue and honor and justice. Maybe they've got the wisdom, the knowledge that I lack. And he went and talked to them and found out they were just using these terms with no understanding and found them to be lacking. They did not know and did not know that they did not know. And this, of course, led them to really not like Socrates. Because people who don't know and really aren't concerned with knowing, what they hate quite a bit is someone who calls them on their ignorance. So how did Socrates roll people through his questioning? Well, a typical Socratic dialectic goes like this. In the opening, Socrates meets up with someone, maybe like outside of a courtroom, or just, wandering the road, or some other place where Socrates might engage in a philosophical ambush. And so the conversation, starts off, kind of every day, like, hey, how about this weather? Did you see that horse race? And how about, that war with Sparta? And then it soon enters the realm of philosophy, where they start talking about, say, virtue, or justice, or love. And then Socrates focuses on one of those key concepts that the whole conversation hinges on. So, for example, it might be a question about the virtue of, professed by politicians, talking about, say, loyalty. And Socrates would, find someone who claimed to know exactly what loyalty is, and then start asking them questions. So then Socrates would say that he's ignorant of this concept. He's confused by it. This other person seems so confident. They seem to know exactly what loyalty is, or virtue is, or justice. And since they know so much, would they not help him understand this difficult concept? And so the other person confidently provides a definition of this concept. They say loyalty is serving, your betters without question, without hesitation. And then Socrates would thank them, and then he would say, I need some further clarification. He might say, okay, does loyalty mean that suppose your better, whoever that is, suppose they are in a fit of madness and they demand that you feed them poison because they believe they cannot be harmed by it. Would that be loyal? And this leads to a further investigation, which reveals a flaw in the definition. So, going back to that kind of silly example, if a person in a fit of madness, demanded something that would hurt them, it would seem disloyal to harm them in their madness, perhaps. And so the other person presents a better definition. So they might say, well, you're right, Socrates. If the person you're loyal to, goes into a fit of madness and starts demanding that they eat, mercury or poison or something, then yeah, you shouldn't do that because they would, you would kill them and you have an obligation to help keep them alive. So loyalty is serving the best interest of the person. And then what Socrates would do would, go back to the process of asking questions. And what would happen is they would go back and forth, repeating these steps over and over. So Socrates raises a problem, person responds back. Socrates raises a problem, person responds back. And eventually, if the person survives this Socratic ordeal, they finally realize that they have no idea what they're talking about. That the thing they seemed utterly confident about, they do not know. So the person who began confidently talking about loyalty is, unquestioningly and unhesitatingly, obeying the will of one's superior. At the end, they're like, I don't know what loyalty is anymore. So this can end in either two ways in the dialogues. One way is the person doesn't like where it's gone, and they try to find some excuse to escape, and like, oh, Socrates, look at the time, I forgot I've got to go, wash my chariot. Or that the person realizes that they're lacking, and they ask Socrates if they can join him in seeking to find an answer. So that is the first part of the Socratic method, questioning. Next, we'll proceed to another part of the Socratic method, namely argumentation.